Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
You're tearing me apart! He's looking at you, kid.
Well, nobody's perfect.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Hello and welcome to Revisiting the Golden Age, a journey through classic Hollywood. I'm Josh Martin. This is a new podcast presented to you by the Inside the Film Room podcast network. So thanks to Zach and Johnny for having me on. So this is episode 1. So you're probably wondering at this point, what is this podcast? What is it going to be? So from the title, you can probably gather I'm focusing in this podcast primarily on films made during Hollywood's golden age, which most people set up as between the 1930s and the 1960s. So what we're going to do these next few months as I go through my first series of podcast episodes, focusing on revisiting, rewatching, and in many cases, looking at films from Hollywood's golden age for the first time. Just going to go through films. I have a number of guests that I'm very excited to talk with over the next few weeks about these films. And yeah, so I think it should be an exciting journey. We're going to start at the beginning, going to start in the 1930s. I thought about doing some episodes on the silent era, but that might be something that I jump back to in the future. But so we're going to deal with a couple of films from the 1930s, move on to the 40s, the 50s, and so on, looping back around in the end. These episodes will be about 30 to 45 minutes long on average. And yeah, so I hope you enjoy. And so today I have with me Jesse Nussman. He's the host of The Latest on Film Inquiry and a Film Inquiry writer. Jesse, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me on, buddy. You know, just always good to be on the mic. You know, you've helped me out on so many podcast ventures, and I'm just thrilled to return the favor. So this is really, really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I was always happy to come on either The Latest or we've done podcasts on, different stuff this year. We did a Nolan podcast. I was on for that.
Yeah, you helped me out when I was doing my 1999 series. I did.
Yes,
under
I remember that one too.
It's Pop Culture Network. So yeah, I'm glad to be on the other side, not hosting, just kind of contributing for once.
No, absolutely. Well, I'm really excited to have you, and I'm excited to talk about today's film, and that is Leo McCarey's Duck Soup from 1933. Produced by Paramount Pictures and starring the Marx brothers. We've got Groucho, Chico, Harpo, and Zeppo Marx doing their thing in what's typically considered the Marx brothers' sort of canonical classic. Duck Soup is commonly regarded as one of the greatest comedies of all time. I'm curious, was this your first time seeing it?
Yes, it actually was. Actually, weirdly, my first Marx Brothers movie. So even when you were just going through kind of the background information just now, I was actually about to ask you myself, where does this stand in? Because I feel like this one and Night at the Opera are the two that I've kind of commonly heard of as being their masterpieces. But yeah, for first Marx Brothers experience, first time seeing this movie, and I really enjoyed. I have heard a lot of people over the years recommend these movies to me, but I think just because where to stream them is always kind of up in the air. It's always been one of those things that I've heard people recommend this movie to me, but I've never actually watched just because it's sometimes tricky to find some of these older movies.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is, as I was sort of picking out some of the films that I wanted to tackle in the first series here. It's access can be tricky with a lot of old Hollywood films, and this one right now, for any of the listeners out there who are subscribers to the Criterion channel, Duck Soup is on there right now. After you listen to this or before you listen to this is a disclaimer for the whole series, but spoilers don't apply here. These movies are anywhere from 50 to nearly 90 years old. And so anything is free game to talk about. But yeah, so if you want to stream it before you listen or after you listen, Criterion Channel, worth the purchase. But yeah, so this is probably the Marx Brothers pinnacle. So like you mentioned, Night at the Opera is their other big film. That happens when they're at MGM, I believe. So these early films, this one, I think their first, because the Marx Brothers are sort of a distinct chapter in post-silent American comedy, because in the silent era you've got Chaplin and Keaton and Harold Lloyd, all of these figures who are almost entirely dependent on physical comedy. And that's not to say that the Marx Brothers don't have plenty, and I mean plenty, of sight gags and purely visual moments. I mean, one of the sequences that we'll absolutely have to talk about in this film is iconic for it's basically a holdover from the silent era. But at the same time, it's impossible to imagine Groucho Marx in a silent film.
Totally.
So the Marx Brothers, it's the early Horse Feathers is another one. I believe that one's in the late 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
They make a couple more films with Paramount.
I think Monkey Business is the other one that I've heard talked about, just because of I was one of the suckers who signed up for the TCM Wine Club over the summer.
Yes.
Of just like, you know what, I'm inside due to the coronavirus, I'm just gonna shovel out like $100 and sign up for this. And that was not one of the ones that was in my little I guess like pamphlet I got from TCM, but one of the ones that I heard from just other people I know on social media was like making the rounds, and a lot of people were watching this summer just because it was part of that package.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing some of the films you watched from the Wine Club, and some of them were like stone cold classics, and other ones are like, I don't know what this movie is, and I've never heard of it.
Would 1,000,000,000% recommend, if only for like it was pretty great for 2 months just to kind of like plow through like 18 bottles of wine and some movies that I had seen before and that I'm sure you'll cover on this show, but plenty others that I was just like, you know what, I don't think I'm ever going to find an excuse to watch this ever again, and this is such a weird time capsule movie. But I did have to bring up that Monkey Business was kind of like the other one that has sort of permeated my circles as one to check out.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's part I have actually on my shelf over there. I have a Blu-ray box set of a couple of the Marx Brothers films from it's always interesting to see like where the rights bounce around with these studios.
Yeah.
So like all these films were at Paramount, but Universal distributes the box set. I guess Universal has the rights to these now. Warner Brothers sends out the later stuff.
I was gonna say Paramount. They're like the Paramount logo closed out this movie, which I like just finished about like 15 minutes before I got on mic.
Yeah,
and like, but it like the modern Universal logo was what sort of opened the movie.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think that like kind of gets back to what I sort of mentioned of like why I've heard of these movies since I was a kid, but had trouble finding them is just because of how the rights bounce around and what companies have them at what moments, and like whether you can find them at like a video store like when I was a kid, or just like bouncing around on a television network like TCM. So yeah, that's like a weird aspect of hunting down some of this stuff.
Oh, it's definitely very complicated, and Criterion and some of the other outlets do a good job of sort of bringing everything together. But I agree. Yeah, so I first saw this film when I was first going through this sort of American classic Hollywood canon.
Mm-hmm.
I was probably like 13 years old. I used the AFI Top 100 list was like my guide, and I just tried to see as much of those films as possible.
I've been there. Definitely did that at some point in my youth.
Yeah, it was, and so it was a fun journey, but it's been fun also revisiting a lot of those movies, because I don't know, when you're 13, like Vertigo doesn't really mean a whole hell of a lot to you, but like watching Vertigo now, it's like, oh my god, this is like, the pinnacle of the studio era.
Yeah.
But like watching that when you're 12 is like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, as far as just like classic movies like that, or even like with me, like you get a reaction from it, but you can't I mean, it's funny you bringing up Vertigo, and not to get us too far down on a digression, but that is a movie I remember seeing at like a pretty, gosh, I was maybe like, I guess I was a freshman in high school the first time I saw it, but of like a movie when you're like 14, like really upset me, but you have a hard time putting your finger on like what it is about that movie that like upsets you. And then
Yeah.
like, you know, watching it, I think my girlfriend and I have been going through a Hitchcock kick lately, with Halloween coming up, and but we watched that and she had never seen it before. And you know, I think having a more articulate way of sort of explaining like why you like something or why something gets a visceral reaction out of you is, I don't know, I that is just the other thing that comes to mind with sort of like you, I kind of went through my phase of, I don't know, it wasn't the AFI list, but I did get a book one year for Christmas when I was in like middle school that was like this like giant coffee table book of like 100 greatest movies ever made.
I think I have that book as well.
Yeah.
I think we might be talking about the same book.
And kind of like making my way through a bunch of those, and so like seeing movies like Vertigo. I don't think Duck Soup was in the whatever volume of that book that I had, but you know, seeing a lot of these classic movies that you're going to talk about on this series, I'm sure, through just like thumbing through and being like, I guess I need to see this. This is important. And yeah, either they don't totally connect to you because you're so used to a more kind of modern sensibility, or they do, but kind of like I was getting at, you can't quite, you're not sort of fully developed enough mentally to kind of pinpoint why it is you sort of feel the way you do about those things.
No, it's definitely yeah, it was that list, probably that book. Roger Ebert's The Great Movies was in there as well, but these were all sort of texts that I was consulting well before I went to school and studied film in depth and stuff like that. But it's funny you talked about you and your girlfriend on a Hitchcock kick. I'm in a Hitchcock class right now, so I just rewatched, and that's partially why Vertigo was on my mind.
Oh, fun!
Like a film that I revisited, and I was like, okay, this really is as great as I thought it was. And so, but Duck Soup is actually a film that I loved the first time, and so I knew very, very little about the Marx Brothers and their style of comedy when I first watched it. All I knew was that it was on the list. It's like 68 or 69 minutes long. It's incredibly short.
Yeah, I think it was 80 some minutes, maybe 86 minutes when I just watched it. It was like just under an hour and a half. So I was like, all right, I can cook lunch really quick and then kind of have it on in the TV as I do that.
No, it's very short, which I think is, there's always like, different discussions over runtimes and stuff. What some people love 90-minute movies, other people, it's like 3 hours is better. In this case, I think this movie is so consistently, I don't even know how to describe it. It is chaotic and bonkers in the sort of best way possible, but it does have sort of that that manic energy that that the Marx Brothers bring to the screen is certainly one that sort of benefits from a shorter runtime where they can't quite wear you down and exhaust you from this style of comedy. So for me, I mean, this movie sort of ends rather abruptly. I guess in a minute I'll give a quick synopsis of just what it's about. I mean, it's not one of those movies that like where the plot matters.
It's a joke vehicle. It's as much of a plot as there is, it's just sort of a thin enough premise to kind of just be a kind of assembly line machine for just like one joke after another.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, it's set in a fictional country called Fredonia, which for all intents and purposes, resembles America with a bit more sort of pageantry, overt pageantry, let's say, and some other differences. And so at the start of the film, the country's in sort of a crisis, which is important context. I mean, it's a film that was made at the height of the Depression. There's certainly some parallels here that you can make politically. It is, a political movie in some senses, though that's certainly not its top priority. You can make some parallels between the situation in 1929, as well as contemporary politics. There's a line that Groucho has that I love that I'll talk about later. Groucho gets appointed like leader of Fredonia, and he gets into this strange feud with the ambassador from another nation. Chico and Harpo play two like spies who like hop across enemy lines. It's never really clear who they're working for at different times. They're playing both sides and just doing silly things. Eventually, there's a war. It gets, it borders on like absurdist humor and like almost like an avant-garde sensibility at times. I mean, there's some jokes here that are just truly out there, and even in ways that I didn't quite remember. And since this was your first time, I was curious to know how you felt about the Marx Brothers style of comedy in general, how you felt about some of those more almost experimental flourishes, and
Yeah, I think I was kind of forming my take before I came on here. I think this is a good sort of patient zero for a kind of comedy that I really respond to. I mean, I'm someone who in the last couple of years I've been thinking a lot about studio comedies and kind of the sort of what makes it into the canon, because I think humor is so highly specific to the time that it's made. But I really respond to comedies that I think are kind of these just well-oiled machines. You know, it's weird to think that, to kind of connect the dots to something more modern. You know, I'm a big fan of the like Adam McKay, Will Ferrell comedies, and I see, you know, a similar sensibility here with what the Marx Brothers are doing to kind of what McKay and Ferrell are doing in something like Step Brothers or Anchorman, which I say totally unironically are like masterpieces of cinema. Like I do not mean that I mean that just as much in like an academic sense as I do kind of frat boy, the movie like makes me lol so hard. I think those, I really admire the way that those movies are just sort of these very tightly engineered kind of thin premise vehicles for just jokes, and of how like it really feels like I think one of the most important elements that's kind of underrated in comedy is tightness. And both hear what the Marx Brothers are doing, and even if you compare it to something like Step Brothers, like how tight those movies are, and where every moment feels like it is engineered for just like maximum funniness, and engineered to just like be a joke delivery system, and almost feeling like the people behind the camera are just kind of how many layers of jokes can we just sort of like put on top of each other in this scene. And that's kind of what to me makes like a comedy stand the test of time, because it you know, that stuff is so subjective to the humor of the moment that you're making it in. But if you have a movie that you can go back and kind of like, they're just sort of cramming as many jokes and sort of funny moments into each individual scene and each individual sequence, I think that makes something fun to kind of revisit, of like, you know, another modern-ish movie, something like Big Lebowski, I feel like has a similar energy to it, of like, that movie was on TV like a month ago, and I watched like 10 minutes of it while I like waited to do something else, and finding stuff in that I found really funny that like I just don't pick up on the first time around. And I feel like the Marx Brothers are sort of like a good kind of origin spot if you like that kind of tight sort of rapid fire comedy energy that I do. And I just love the sense of, for lack of a better phrase, like commitment to the bit, where just like it cringes me to no end whenever a comedy is like, we got to stop to the jokes because we got to have like the serious monologue, or we got to have like the sad scene where, you know, like, damn, he's really upset that he was supposed to wind up with that girl. Of like, so many of my favorite comedies like have those moments. Like Wedding Crashers is something that has to have the serious like, damn, Owen Wilson's he really just needs to tell Rachel McAdams he loves her. But I almost respond more to when a comedy team, whether it's an actor and a director or producers or a team of actors, as in the Marx Brothers, can kind of keep that energy going and are just like, we're not going to sacrifice a moment, and if anything, we're just sort of going to tighten it so you never get a moment when you're not laughing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's certainly, you touch on something that I think is very true of the comedic impulse to always have that sort of scene that brings back the emotional pull and connects us with the characters, and we really have to care about what's happening. And I'm sure the studios have market tested that and have sold themselves on the fact that that is what comedies have to do to be successful. But I agree with you. I mean, in some cases, it's just like, it's not strictly necessary, and not every comic persona needs that scene. And I think the example of the Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly comedies is really fruitful and interesting, because maybe 10 years ago it would have been something of a stretch for someone to go, yeah, well, I think Talladega Nights and Anchorman and Step Brothers are like basically masterpieces. Now that seems almost closer to a consensus of sort, especially now that McKay, especially now that he's drifted so far to, I don't know what his next movie is going to be. It just announced that mega cast this week.
I just want to see what that is, but it's weird to, without to go down a rabbit hole about what his career has turned into. It was weird of like, I did a podcast of my own on Oliver Stone not too long ago, and was like, it's weird that Adam McKay has sort of like picked up the torch of like, I'm going to be the Oliver Stone for this next generation of like, that's not who I would have imagined. But I kind of prefer, I have next to nothing to say about Vice anymore, but and even if I find some moments of The Big Short to be creative and impressive in the way he tries to sort of explain that kind of very complicated economic issue, I just sort of prefer him I think he's got such a great handle on that same sort of tightness and sort of rapid fire energy that the Marx Brothers have, that I don't know, I'm always a little sort of sad when he's not working in that mode.
Yeah, it makes me wonder though, I mean, because one of the reasons that those films have connected so much, and I think this is a connection to the sort of what you could, I guess, loosely consider the politics of Duck Soup, is like those films, Talladega Nights and Step Brothers in particular, and to a lesser extent Anchorman, although they're all equally applicable, but have all been sort of read as commentaries on sort of Bush era masculinity and
totally.
sort of American stupidity writ large. And I almost wonder to what extent, because there's always a question between what we're reading into the work and what the writers and directors actually think they're doing. And with McKay's turn to, I would say, to put it nicely, an extremely didactic mode of like politics, where he basically feels he has to look in the camera and scream at the audience, this is what I'm saying and this is what you need to think, which has its value in some cases. I mean, Spike Lee's can be a didactic filmmaker, but does it with a force and a sort of formal precision that McKay has little room for these days. But it makes you wonder to what extent he knew that the other films were overtly political. To what extent that matters, I don't know. I mean, it's fun to certainly, I hate the sort of practice of going back and reading things and going, oh, this is just like today. But I mean, it is kind of delightful when Groucho in Duck Soup is singing that opening number, and my favorite line from it is, he goes, if you think this country's bad off now, just wait till I get through with it. And I mean, it's it is hard not to have lived through the last 4 years of American life and not find that both, cutting and utterly hilarious at the same time. So I think it is interesting that this sort of, as you put it, the rapid fire joke machine, as both this sort of visceral experience, as something that this sort of constant comedy. I mean, part of the appeal of Groucho Marx is that his character always seems to be, no matter who he's playing, and he's always playing Groucho, but always seems to be one step ahead. I mean, always has a one-liner in response, always has some sort of clever wordplay, and it's hard to keep up with them. And so that makes sort of So you have that working in line with this sort of loose and sort of gentle, but also very cutting political commentary, and so yeah, I think it's a really fun film, and also one that can that makes you laugh in some ways for its political connections, as well as its purely sort of sensory comedy details, of which there are many.
Yeah, I think certainly the political read on it. I mean, who just like doesn't it just kind of goes to show how like eternal the idea of like the people who run governments are buffoons
Yes.
is, and
Yes.
being able to kind of see this like clear line between this stuff and like, I don't know, Doctor Strangelove through like some of the Armando Iannucci stuff that like you watch like Veep or something, and like that's a cartoon essentially. It's like a live action
Absolutely.
cartoon.
Absolutely.
And that's another show that feels kind of engineered for like maximum joke impact. And I think there is something eternal that makes this a movie that people even today can enjoy and find really funny. I laugh pretty consistently throughout it, and I think there is just something eternal to the idea that like the people who run countries are buffoons, and that just like people are like narcissistic assholes, and
Yeah.
just like you put like just people being people, and you put them in positions of power, and like they aren't going to lose their sort of narcissistic asshole sensibility,
Yeah.
and that's just going to kind of inflate problems. I don't know. I just think that that's another thing I thought about, other than the like who are the modern day equivalents of people who work in this kind of comedic sensibility, is just sort of I don't know, the sense that this is kind of in a long tradition that has continued throughout the years in film and television of like, world leaders are idiots and are like
Yeah.
not looking out for anyone but themselves.
Yeah, and no, and I think the Veep comparison is on point too, because I think there's differences, but there's a sort of a verbal dexterity to both the Marx Brothers and the Iannucci stuff. I mean, obviously Veep is on a R-rated level of just, but some of the insults in that show are just so vicious and so outlandish that I just laugh every time. And the Marx Brothers obviously operate in a different register, but it's still sometimes just this like pulling from different, the wordplay is immaculate. And I think you're right on the question of this sort of eternal nature of political leaders being completely unsuitable for the offices they hold. And but I also think this film is interesting. It is sort of this timeless critique of the idiocy of leaders, and it also feels very much rooted in a post World War One moment. I mean, this is 15 years after World War One, but certainly this is a satire. It is a broad comedy. It also, in its last 15 minutes, it's a war movie. I mean, there are real combat scenes, obviously on a level of absurdity and sort of cartoonishness straight out of Looney Tunes.
I have to say that last sequence of just like that last, like, I don't know, 10-15 minutes, however much of the movie that is, that's probably like the hardest I laughed in the entire of, like, I was laughing before, but that just reaches, I think that makes the kind of like another fun comparison to the just like think of the, I don't know, the newsroom like street battle in Anchorman. It's like,
Yes,
like it reaches that kind of like high level of absurdity that just every single like little cut to Groucho Marx like wearing a different costume, to there's the bit where they say, like, this is probably like the hardest I laughed the entire movie, is where I think like one of the generals says to him, like, we have a man out there who's trying to like recruit troops, and it's just this guy out in the middle of like an intense like World War One battle scene who just has like a cardboard sign on him that's just like, please sign up for the draft, and he's just like struggling to kind of walk in the mud, and there's like bullets and missiles flying by him, and it's just like that, like one like little like 30-second cut like made me laugh harder than like anything in the movie. It's just that kind of like perfect level of just sort of over the top absurdity. I think is quite genius, and something I think is just like easily transmittable to today. I mean, I think you find in like the best comedies, as much as we make comedies these days, which is a sad other conversation, but it's something that I think is eternal about this movie as well, because going back to what I said earlier about comedies feeling sometimes stuck in the times that they were made. I think it can sometimes be hard to, tell someone today, like, hey, you should check out this Marx Brothers comedy. Because I think we're so accustomed to being like, I don't know, is that going to be funny anymore? Because like what people found funny in whenever this was made in like the 1930s is not going to necessarily be funny today. But there are those moments that I think, you can draw those clear lines to people are still taking the kind of cinematic lessons from this stuff. And I don't know, like that level of absurdity is just always going to be funny no matter what time period you're in.
No, I agree. I mean, I think the Marx Brothers age in a really sort of flattering light. I mean, there is sort of one of the other questions beyond just the question of will something be funny. There is always the question of will this be like horribly dated in other senses? In terms of culturally insensitive. There's one joke in this movie that Groucho makes at one point that made me cringe and go, ooh, I didn't remember that from the first time. A sort of, I would say, incredibly insensitive racial statement, but that is, as part of over the course of this series, it's something that as many film professors have explained to me, even when I took a comedy class last year, this was sort of the preface of these are things that we have to sort of reckon with comedies, especially from, I'd say, the 30s to even the 60s. I know we're going to talk about Breakfast at Tiffany's at some point, and even that on an even more sort of elevated scale.
Let me tell you, I'm very familiar as someone who dates an Asian American. I'm very familiar with the whenever you get to that episode, the complications around one particular character in that movie that, that stuff, I think, I almost think like we put too much weight into that, and not necessarily in a like, just ignore it or like we have to reckon with it. But I think, if we're going to talk about how comedies age, I think there's just something about, you kind of just have to roll with the punches, and of just like, it's outside of our control.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I not to get us too far on a tangent, but like it reminds me of something like, this was a couple of years ago. There was like a college group that was like greatly protesting the playing of like 16 Candles or something on campus. And of like, I heard from a lot of kind of Gen X people who sort of grew up with that movie as like an important teen comedy that were just like, screw the millennials and the Gen Z kids that like want to cancel this movie. And I don't know, I'm just sort of like, that's kind of the dice you got to roll with, of like, that doesn't mean that like the idea that like Ferris Bueller, if we're going to talk about John Hughes movies, is probably going to like last throughout the generations of like, that movie still feels as modern today as it did in 1986 or whenever it came out. But of like, I don't know. I think that's just what we have to do as a culture, and just like what you as an audience have to weigh of like, I know the specific moment you're talking about in this movie too. And I think that's something of like, watching this being like, yikes. And then just like going over it. Whereas like, I don't know, some movies it is harder to sort of deal with that. And I think that's just sort of the natural evolution of like, the canon isn't written in amber, and of like, stuff is going to change based off of the values and of something like 16 Candles. Like I don't like 16 Candles, and I'm just like, I don't, just as I'm sure like some 45-year-old doesn't want to be told they're like a douchebag for liking it. Like, I don't want to be told I'm like not smarter. I don't understand comedy just because like I don't think that movie's funny because it's got some like pretty effed up stuff in it that is just like would have been funny in the 80s but is like not funny today because our values are different. So yeah, I got us off on a bit of a tangent. I apologize, but of like I do think that's interesting, and you bringing that up of like I found this movie just as much kind of enjoyable from a modern standpoint as it probably would be at the time, and that's even without some jokes landing. But yeah, I think that's just when we get into these conversations of like, does this comedy hold up? I feel like that's just sort of, I don't think it's like putting it before like a judiciary committee and we got a vote of like, is this movie acceptable or not? I think it's just sort of a natural evolution thing that happens in the culture. But I think this one, except for maybe like that one moment that you kind of hinted at, I think it's by pretty fine from what I remember.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, and I think it is, I mean, to sort of on one side to just any sort of film from a previous era that would be sort of problematic in any ways, of which almost all of them are in one way or another, to just sort of ignore that art as dated or sort of that to me strikes me as something that you don't want to do in any situation. But also at the same time, I do think, it was something that caught me off guard, having only seen this film when I was 12 or 13, and that's not something you're quite as attuned to at that point. And I think it's always worth talking about and always worth examining the sort of gender and racial politics of these films. And I think they can be really interesting conversations. I mean, as you sort of hinted at, the history of American cinema is filled with examples of racism and sexism, and we have to grapple with that because it in many ways built the sort of films or the film culture that we have today. But yeah, I mean, in this, this one's one gag that sort of, today feels insensitive. Looking at 6 years later, Gone with the Wind, I mean, that's a whole other conversation. So certainly, but it's conversations we'll have to have throughout this series. And I think they can be really, really interesting and insightful. But to go back to the, to sort of move back off that topic, go back to the ending.
Yes, let's talk positive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I should emphasize it's something that pops up in a lot of films, and but I do love this film, and I think it's really a really terrific comedy, and one that was certainly, if not even, possibly even ahead of its time. So I've sort of hinted at the sort of general craziness of the Marx Brothers comedies, the fact that the sort of anything goes sensibility. The word that's typically used to describe their films is anarchic, and I think that's very fitting. And I think it's funny because, I mean, in some ways, Gen Z and sort of late millennials, of which I fall on that borderline between the two. I don't really belong to either group, so I'm a man without a generation. And so, but I do think like Gen Z in particular likes to think that they like invented this like absurdist random style of comedy that dominates the culture today. And in some cases, yeah, that's true. I mean, I've heard there's been many jokes in the past of like dating back a particular strain of like absurdist humor to that, what was it, the What You Say sketch that Andy Samberg and Bill Hader did on SNL, and which I think is true to an extent, but like this sort of humor has been, I mean, one of my favorite gags in this movie, in addition to all the stuff at the end, which is just nuts. I love, there's this continual back and forth between Chico, Harpo, and this guy who sells lemonade on the street. And there's two scenes where Harpo burns his hat, and there's no reason for it. There's no real rationale. He just keeps doing it, and he keeps cutting things, and he's like a pyromaniac, and it's, totally random. I mean, it's like watching two children run around. I mean, and it's totally delightful. But I think it does predate a lot of, I mean, everyone likes to think that certain things are, the one we kept talking about, the sort of randomness or the constant joke machine of this movie. And one of the scenes that came out from, or that came to mind from a contemporary film I'm not sure how big of a fan of Pop Star you are.
I like it. I've not seen it since it was in theaters, but I
Okay.
remember like finding it
Yeah.
funny when it came out.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of that movie, and I love The Lonely Island in general, and I think they do have a sort of post Marx Brothers sensibility in some ways. But there's
Definitely,
a
yeah.
scene in that movie where there's a bee attack, and the camera just cuts out all of a sudden, and we get this just sort of wild scene of Tim Meadows and Andy Samberg trying to fight off these giant hornets that we never see. And it strikes me as something that we would get in a Marx Brothers film. I mean, it's just totally sort of out there, and it's really funny because I do think you sort of hinted at this earlier too. The sort of dire straits of contemporary American cinematic comedy. The fact that we don't get many comedies, certainly not many comedies like this, and also the fact that like this is directed by Leo McCarey. I wouldn't say he's one of the sort of major figures of the old Hollywood era, but certainly a director who won Oscars and did a lot of major work. I mean, Ruggles of Red Gap might be a hard film to find, but it's great if anyone's ever seen that before. I haven't seen probably his most famous film after this, Make Way for Tomorrow. But from what I've gathered of the rest of McCarey's work, never really did anything like this again. But that's sort of the beauty of like the studio system in some ways of like you just sort of plugged in. Okay, we've got this director and these stars, and we want them to make this movie. Go do it, and the result is something that's just like even today feels bold and experimental and unpredictable. And I've seen this film twice now. I always enjoy it, and I think it's on so many levels delightful and hilarious.
Yeah, I agree, and I think bringing up the something, since this is probably going to be the first episode that I'm excited to listen to more of the episodes you do, of just like there are these kind of unsung kind of classic Hollywood just sort of workman directors that would just sort of be housed up at studios and would kind of bounce around different genres. And it is always interesting of like, I'm not familiar with much of his other work either, but I'm always fascinated in the kind of threads people can find between some of these more like sporadic projects that these just sort of like standard studio hand people would be. And I mean that's how we think of Howard Hawks. Like Howard Hawks is like the best
Hawks
example.
Is right on my mind. Yes.
Yeah, it's like the best example of like there is a generation of movie lovers that were just like obsessed with his movies and kind of draw these lines between all of these varying genres, and you get someone who's just like an insanely entertaining director and could kind of just like freely work within so many different mediums. So yeah, I'm interested to hear about people like that.
Yeah, and we'll be talking about in about probably a month or so. I think we'll do you and I are going to talk about Howard Hawks' The Big Sleep.
Yeah, which I've never seen.
I've never seen that either.
Hawks movies I've never seen, so I'm
I've watched a lot of Hawks over the last year. I've just finished up writing a thesis for my academic work in film studies as an undergrad, and Hawks wasn't the focus, but Tarantino has called Hawks' Rio Bravo a hangout film, and that's a concept that I sort of work to interrogate. And I've seen a lot of Hawks stuff now, and whether it's the screwball comedies or the westerns or something that exists in a more sort of generically unstable space or unstable space, like Only Angels Have Wings. I mean, he's a really interesting filmmaker. And these are all lots of interesting filmmakers in the 30s through the 50s and the studio era. And so, yeah, I'm excited to have more of those conversations. And if you listen to this podcast and you're excited to, or you want to check out Duck Soup, highly encourage it. And if you just want a taste of the film, I would look up this movie has a very famous mirror scene, which if you've taken film studies classes, you will have seen this before. And it's very funny, and it's one of the probably most famous comedic sequences in history. I think Criterion's description even calls attention to it. So
Yeah, just like a masterclass in just sort of like visual comedy filmmaking, I think.
It's totally silent too at a certain point. Like there's no like sound. It's wonderful. So Jesse, any final thoughts on Duck Soup before I head over to to our outro for the day?
No, I think, I think kind of just my big thing was just, I'd never seen this before, and I'm pleasantly surprised at kind of how much it holds up, and kind of a lot of the comparisons I feel like you can make to, and sort of through lines to modern comedies that we consider classics. And I don't know, I think even if you walk away from this movie and don't necessarily have this kind of like laugh fest that maybe we're hyping it up to be, I think it is on just a pure academic level, just sort of a masterclass in comedy filmmaking, and just on every level, from just sort of like the pitter patter dialogue to all these kind of great, very, very elaborate visual gags. Yeah, so that would just kind of be my last thing, is I think even if, you see this and you're like, that didn't hold up, or, that's not the hoot fest that I thought it was going to be, like, there's, I think, a lot to learn from it, and a lot of kind of history and things you could see applied in other movies that are sort of like established craft in this.
It's no, it's definitely a great film, and one to sort of a good first stop if you're looking to. I'm sure we have sort of a wide range of listeners, and if you don't have much experience with classic American comedy, it's one that's worth checking out for sure.
Also, just sign up for the Criterion channel. Like, come on,
yes.
What else are you doing? It's $10 a month. I just like. Yeah.
It's the best $10 I spend every month for sure. It's a great tool, and they put together a great lineup every month. So yeah, sort of free plug for the Criterion channel, and for look out for other sort of wherever you can find classic films, because sometimes they're hard to find. So, but Jesse, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate you helping to kick off this podcast. And I believe in a couple weeks, I don't know when, I've got my schedule somewhere, but you'll be back to talk about an early Hitchcock film, Alfred Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes. I'm excited to have that conversation.
Same. Very, very excited to talk Hitchcock with you.
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll learn a lot about our inner sort of desires and psychology.
Yes.
I have a feeling.
Absolutely. So yeah, you can find Jesse's work at Film Inquiry, and check out the latest on Film Inquiry. Always, when do you release new episodes of that? Do you know?
Every Monday. So,
okay.
We just whatever the latest release is right now, but which is it's changing by the week every time something gets moved around. But I have a very like exciting Aaron Sorkin episode that everyone should check out. That's, I think, like the latest thing we did. The latest on the latest.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to listening to that. And so yeah, follow Jesse on Twitter. You can find my work at numerous places. Follow me on Twitter at Martin on Movies. You can find, I don't write as much anymore right now, but who knows when I'll start again. I've written for Film Inquiry, written for Inside the Film Room. I'm on the one of the latest Inside the Film Room podcasts. You can also find my work at Aspect, UNC's new journal of film and media studies. You find all that on my Twitter page. I'll be back soon with another episode of Revisiting the Golden Age. Jake Lawler, Inside the Film Room co-founder, will be joining me to talk about Todd Browning's 1932 film Freaks. Looking forward to that conversation. But for now, thanks to Jesse again. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time.